Shalom, Professor Andreas Schleicher. It is wonderful for you to be here and to give us of your time to answer some of our questions. So shalom to you.
Shalom, and thanks for hosting me.
For those, if there's anybody still who do not know who you are, Professor Schleicher is Director for Education and Skills at the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. He initiated and oversees the Program for International Student Assessment, which we all know as PISA, and other international instruments that have created a global platform for policymakers, researchers, and educators across nations and cultures to innovate and transform educational policies and practices. Professor Schleicher is considered by many ministers and education leaders as the most important man in education in the world. So it's really a privilege to have you with us today. We'll start with something personal, which I have to ask you, is how is it that somebody who studied physics and in Germany and a major in mathematics and statistics from Australia has become a leading director at the OECD? I mean, I would assume it would be in some kind of high-tech company or something.
Yeah, in fact, I started my career in medical industry. And then, during my study, one day I received a letter that I still had to do my military service in Germany. And they offered you, 1 year of military service or 2 years of civil service. I opted for the civil service, and they sent me into a school with disadvantaged children. And I really started to enjoy my job. And I really thought, in education, I may be able to make more of a difference than I can do with just physics. And that's where I stayed. But actually, I think I brought a lot of the thinking of science into education through my job. So I can see the best of both worlds now.
So you're a living example of interdisciplinary work, studying and work, and how all of this can be combined for the better of civilization, I guess. I think we're going to start with somewhat of a basic question that we've been, I guess, thinking about for the last few years since the fourth technology, the COVID, which also contributed to things, even the introduction of AI. But we seem that the higher education is facing a lot of challenges. And I think what we're seeing very practically and physically is that the number of students that are coming to our classes are really going down and down. It's not that enrollment is going down. We actually have the same enrollment, but they seem not to want to come to the classes. And if they come, they're not engaged. They're doing something else, usually on their iPhones. There's a lot of reasons, and we constantly talk and read about them, but from your perspective and knowledge, what do you think are the most contributing factors to this unfortunate situation?
Look, if you would run a supermarket, not a university, and every day you see from 100 customers, 30 walk out without buying anything. You see that today, tomorrow, in a week, in a year. You change your inventory. You change your offer. And universities have been very, very slow to do that. I mean, there are many reasons, as you say, for why we see this declining engagement. But I do think the dominant reason is relevance. You can no longer pull young people into a classroom to teach them a course which they could see maybe in better quality somewhere on the internet. I do think universities need to think hard how to reinvent themselves so they provide more relevant education in a more engaging way, where young people are not just passive consumers, but actually, active participants in that co-creation process.
So what would you recommend? What were the things that, if we believe that it is important to come to the university and it is important to have this engagement, is it only a matter of changing the teaching methods, or is it more than that?
Yeah, I think teaching methods is part of it. But, when you compare universities with high quality vocational education in some countries, many young people actually nowadays prefer to go the vocational route. They like to work on real problems. They like to work with real people. They like to make mistakes that have real consequences. And I think we can bring some of that into the university space, where students are more actively engaged in in research, in the knowledge creation process, where, they are taken serious as, active participants. I think you're going to see a different kind of, it's not just, changing pedagogy. I do think that's part of it as well. You still have, many faculty who see their prime purpose in research, not in teaching, and young people feel that. And nowadays they have alternatives. So, but I do think, a more active approach to learning, something where students feel they make a real difference and real contribution, I think is very important. It's not easy to do, but, it's an area where I do believe high quality vocational education can offer some really interesting insights, because they see much lower dropout in many countries.
I mean, obviously, what you're saying makes a lot of sense. And I think we can probably many agree with you. However, from what you're saying, I think there are two major arguments that people have been made, staff members, some even in leading universities or in leading positions. One of which is it the role of the university? Well, one of the question is, what is the role of a university? And right now, on purpose, maybe we'll talk about this later, I'm saying it on purpose as opposed to colleges, because in Israel, at least when it started the colleges were more vocational targeted, whereas universities were more broader mind thinking or research oriented, providing general skills for life, but not necessarily vocational targeted. Better ability to express yourself in reading and writing, creative thinking, critical thinking, but not necessarily vocational targeted. So one argument is then, what would be the difference, or are we changing the roles of the university if it's more vocational targeted? And the other argument would be, this is like a dream world. I would love to have my class, my 200, 300 students divided into small groups. Let's do creative thinking, solve problems, do PBL. We've seen examples like that in Europe, which is, we were all drooling over these examples, but for us, it doesn't seem to be scalable because it requires different types of budget, even different types of staff members. Not every researcher can be a mentor to this type of studying. So how do we do it?
Yeah, I think the questions of mission and resources are both very relevant. On the question of mission, I do believe that any education institution has that role of maintaining, curating, advancing the frontiers of knowledge, but also that responsibility to bring that knowledge to the next generation. I don't think you can divorce those roles in meaningful ways. I do believe these are, two sides of the same coin, and you should not see the students as, a nuisance to gain your money or a consumer of your knowledge. But I do think, that mentorship that universities provide for young people, I believe is actually an integral part of that mission to advance the frontiers in academia and also in society. On the question of resources, there's of course, there's always the reality, but we shape that reality in many different ways. Some universities are actually, able to, generate those resources, and I know, we consider universities a public good. They should not charge tuition, but the reality is often that then, you do not have the resources to provide the kind of learning experience that young people really need to be successful, and also to give young people the ownership they need over what they learn and how they learn and where they learn and when in their lives they learn. I think that's really, really the key, and that, takes resources. Data from the OECD, our data show very clearly that, it's an amazing investment. The returns on that investment far outweigh any conceivable investment. So I think, that money argument is actually quite, short-sighted. It's often, the result of policies. In many countries we say, education is important, but we're not willing to donate enough public resources to this, and at the same time, we do not allow institutions to, mobilize, tuition private resources. And I think that leaves universities often with insufficient resources. You could do that as a university in the past because, you had that monopoly over education. You no longer have that. Nowadays, young people will find better and better alternatives. So I do think universities should think hard how they can, make sure that they can provide the learning environments where they can remain the architects, of the knowledge of the future.
This may not be even the mandate I have to ask this question, but from what you're saying, it sounds like that even if we would like as a university to make those changes that you're talking about, and I think many of us agree that we need to do it, and we're already in some kind of process doing it, you can't disconnect it actually from the government, the Ministry of Education, those that are actually providing the money, because in Israel, education is actually one of the biggest, has one of the biggest budgets. At least until the war, it had the biggest budget. Maybe now it's has a competition with the Ministry of Defense, but in terms of money-wise, definitely. So what you're saying is actually we need somebody from even above to restructure the money allocation. May not even mean necessarily the lack of resource, is more like how you allocate it.
Yeah, I think that the hardest decision that we make as individuals and societies is, how do we strike the balance between the present and the future? When we spend public money, do we invest it in current consumption, or do we invest it, in our future, in education and related things? And it's a very difficult choice to make. There are very clear trade-offs. At the very same time, if you look historically speaking, it was those nations who gave sufficient emphasis to the future of their country, and that is the education of their citizens, that became the most successful economies. I think that historical growth relationship is just very, very robust, and I do think we have, in recent time, often shortchanged the future for the present. And I believe, funding regimes are part of the issue of this. We have, safeguarded, some principles that universities should be free, which is very nice. But at the same time, if then society is not willing to put enough money into this, and we do not allow individuals and, other players to complement this, we'll end up with insufficient investment. And I do think we need to rethink, how do we, on the one hand, mobilize the resources from society for our future, and at the same time ensure equitable and fair access. And personally, I believe you can reconcile those objectives.
So, assuming we are in one university, right now we're presenting Tel Aviv University because this is where we're handling this interview, and we hear you and we believe this is the right way to go. Even in Israel, we're the largest university, 30,000 students. We have over 1,000 senior staff members with tenureship, so it's considered the biggest one. It's what we called in our slang a heavy ship. And we'd like to change even a little bit of its course to take a different course now. We still have our, government, whatever, but we can't wait because, like you're saying, it's here and now that we have to already change our trajectory towards the future. What would you recommend us? What would be the things that we can do, not based on what right now we can do and have? I mean, we're trying to do things, but what, in your eyes, what are the things that are more important as an institute, not as a country, but as an institute, if we want to start making that difference?
It's an interesting question. For a start, I believe that universities can take a much more active role in charting and understanding the future. We often see education, in a very instrumental way. We prepare people for what we think are tomorrow's jobs and so on. And I do believe actually universities, for a start, could make a much bigger contribution to understand the future of, society, the future of work. Like, think about artificial intelligence. Every now and then we get surprised what the next version of ChatGPT brings out. And I do believe, universities could, much more actively help us understand and anticipate the evolution of AI capabilities. What is this going to mean for public policy? In a way, not complain about public policy, but help policy to be better prepared for the future as you see it coming. I mean, you as a university, you hold the key to understanding the drivers of the future, the trends that shape our future. And I think we often, just wait what's going to happen. And I actually think universities could make itself a lot more relevant to shaping the collective future that we face and helping public policy, industry really understand what are those big trends, how are they going to play out, how are they going to shape what young people will need to learn, so that we do not just in a very short-sighted way run behind current labor markets.
So in a way, what I'm hearing you saying, there are the two levels that we can contribute. One is the more far future, how we're going to prepare for the future. We'll discuss that in a second. But the other one is, what can we do now? How can we do now? Because we still want to maintain the university, the enrollment, our relevance. That's something that's really important. And we seem to have, because we call it, like we're now in this intermediate phase where some of our, even senior staff members, AI, some of them are not even literate AI, although we're making progress, but they're not there yet. Some of our students are not there yet, and others are very AI or have AI literacy. So now that we're in this intermediate phase, how can we make sure that we are relevant? And we need to progress much faster than we are willing to do because of who we are. We have to teach, we have to do research. Why do we have to take this role on us as a staff member? Which is a question, because that's the only way we can make a difference. If we all together will make that difference.
You described the university as a big tanker, and in a way I can see that. At the same time, a university has also an army of amazing speedboats. And I think by making those speedboats better visible, by making them more tangible, by coordinating them so that they have a greater impact, I think that's a very important function. Yes, I believe institutions are always heavy, they're always slow to respond, but they have a lot of if you can create agency among different actors in a university, starting from students, from faculty, by putting them part on that mission. I think you can unleash a lot of very, very important energy that the society, the economy really needs.
Yeah. So I'm listening to you, and also all of us are listening to you here at the conference. And one of the questions that I think at least some of our faculty members would ask is that, on one hand, we understand that need to make the changes, send out those speedboats. On the other hand, we still have a basic, what we call the basic education, maybe the humanities, that at least we have 9 faculties at the university. Half of them are from what we call the humanities or the social sciences, arts, liberal arts. How do we put this together? How do we make sure that we don't lose them on the way? Because what happens right now, that we are losing them on the way, and we think these are important parts of our society and a democratic society.
No, I very much agree. I think we should not see, STEM and humanities as two opposing ends on a large spectrum where we have to make choices and trade-offs. They are two sides of the same coin. And I think the beauty of our times today is that they have actually become very, very close together. You want a great engineer, but you want an engineer who makes ethical decisions, because, technology will just amplify, accelerate whatever you do. You want, an educator, but, as an educator, you're no longer just, reproducing subject matter knowledge. You have to be a good coach, a good mentor, a great facilitator, creative designer of innovative learning environments. In that sense, I think the humanities and the sciences actually get closer and closer together. That's why I also think in the future, maybe we should give young people 2 degrees. One thing that, they can turn into a better job and a better life, absolutely. But at the same time, also something else where they feel, I can make a difference in this world. I can, shape and contribute to the lives of other people, contribute to my country. And then maybe in that space in between, you'll find your profession, you'll find your future. And I think maybe the time has come to actually, resolve some of those separations, institutional separations, and think about education in a much more integrated way. That's certainly what the times in which we live, ask from us. The kind of things that are easy to teach, easy to assess, have become, easy to digitize, to automate. You know that better than anyone. And I think we need to ask ourselves much harder, what makes us human in a world of artificial intelligence? How do we complement the artificial intelligence with the human skills that make us different? And I think in that space, I think you can reconcile both worlds.
Some of our staff members would say we can't give up any of the basic courses that are required, whereas others would argue, no, let's give up some of the basic courses because AI can do certain things. Let's focus on what AI cannot do. What is your thinking on this? What would you take? Because clearly the point is that we need to even reduce, we keep adding and adding and adding number of hours for the students. They can't keep up. At this point, they don't even want to come, some of them, because they realize they can actually work with whatever they've learned somewhere for 6 months or in the army or whatever, and they don't need that degree to actually go to work. And why do they have to waste their time? For them, it's a waste of time. So how do we even, before we persuade the students, how do we persuade the staff members that this is a time when you need to let go some of these courses and some of the actual material because they can get it in another way, and put together what you're talking about? How do you persuade them?
Well, you just have to look around you. I mean, our education institutions educate often in a way that is a mile wide, but just an inch deep. We teach a lot of stuff at relatively superficial depths. And I think the art really, or the key for the future is to teach fewer things at greater depths, and much of the content knowledge is, now you do not need to accumulate that individually. We have that collectively through, technology. It is so much more important to be able to think like a scientist than to, just know a lot of facts and figures about biology and chemistry. Can you design an experiment? Can you distinguish questions that are scientifically investigable from those that are not? History, do you need to remember all names and places? Probably not. But can you think like an historian? Do you understand how the narrative of your society has emerged, how it developed, how it advanced, and sometimes unravels? I think it's that epistemic understanding that is really the key. And I think it's hard for faculty. We see that everywhere. Wherever curricula are designed, they become crowded with content because everyone believes what I know, everybody else needs to know. But if you ask yourself, what is the structure you want to bring to young people in which they can chart their own way, create their own knowledge? Now, what are the ways of thinking, the ways of working? It's much harder to do, absolutely.
Yes.
At the same time, I think that is what the future is about. If you understand the nature of science, if you can think like a scientist, and at the same time you can think like a philosopher, you can think like an historian, you have an amazing capacity then to become a creative user of modern technology. If you are just used to accumulate knowledge in the silo of a single discipline, tomorrow's world, that's not good enough. So I actually think it's hard. I see the point for faculty, and one of the best ways for faculty is to spend more time to working in interdisciplinary ways. If you're only used to think and work in your own discipline, then why would you not expanded at the expense of other disciplines, but if you have learned to look at problems through different disciplinary lenses, if you have learned to connect the dots where the next big idea comes from, I think it's going to be much easier for you to understand that, the beauty really lies in the interactions between those different ways of thinking and ways of walking.
Well, you've definitely convinced me. I hope those who listen to you will be convinced as well. But I think something that can convince those who are unconvinced yet. Do you have any examples from first-tier universities that have already made those changes or are making those changes now, that are actually downsizing the content on expense of the things that you've been talking about?
Well, we have better knowledge on schools where we do have actually fair amount of really good examples. I mean, almost a decade ago, Japan was perhaps one of the first countries, cutting down 30% of instruction time or instruction content. It caused a huge outcry. Whenever you add something to the curriculum, you will have many friends. Whenever you cut something, you have some really bad enemies. But they did it. That was the first country. The world learned a lot from this. And since then, we have seen actually at the school level where we have good data on curriculum content, quite many efforts to, work towards teaching fewer things at greater depths, to strengthen depths of understanding at the, rather than just accumulation of surface content.
And do you see in Japan, since this is already, there is some kind of, there's a decade, 10 years of experience now, do they see differences in outcomes, or can you compare the graduates in those places and what they achieved both in research and in vocational working places? Is there any?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, for example, in the past, Japanese school students had a hard time answering any form of open question. They were just used to, things that they memorize and then reproduce when asked. So multiple choice tests were what worked for them. After that reform, they saw really good improvements on the capacity of students to respond to more complex, open-ended kind of tasks. So that's something that, has really had an impact now. And but if we don't do that, AI is going to replace much of that. You no longer compete on the accumulation of knowledge. You compete on understanding the ideas, the structure, the concepts, being able to reflect, to think, to extrapolate from what and apply your knowledge in novel situations. Now, that's really where we can still do better than AI as humans.
So if we're talking about now the future, there are definitely different pictures of how are we going to look at the future, because one of the problems when we predict the future is that if you know more or less what the trajectory is, then you can maybe predict. But what I'm seeing is that every year now since COVID, things change. You don't change the speed, the rate at which things change vary. Some of them change so quickly, like the AI. So in such times where things are so unpredictable, what would be or a few models of the future that you would think this is the way that, and I'm saying something very general, not like what are the possibilities, where would we should go higher education, what are the possible outcomes that can work for us based on all these changes that we're facing?
Interesting question, and I agree. It is actually very dangerous to just think about the future that you think is most likely, and maybe even more dangerous to just think about the future that you like most. But what I do believe universities actually could make such a great contribution to society is to help society engage with different versions of the future by better understanding the broad trends that shape our future. No, we don't know what the future is, but we actually have some really, really good information, on how, whether you talk about demography, economic polarization, climate change, whatever, you can actually see some, broad factors that shape the space in which this future is being created. And I think those factors are ones that universities can articulate, quantify, make visible in society. I think that's an incredibly important role. And then, help policymakers, help society to develop scenarios, develop different versions of the future. The better we become at being agile to move between different versions of the future, the better we will be prepared for the future that eventually arrives. And for me, that is an incredibly important role that universities should help to, help societies engineer the future they want by helping them understand, what is the opportunity space in which we operate? What are the big drivers shaping that future? What are the choices that we will have to make? What are the trade-offs that are in front of us? And I think our economies, our societies, our political environments, our democracies would incredibly benefit from that. No?
So if we need to now think about it as an institution like Tel Aviv University, and we don't know yet what the future lays ahead, but we know that we have to make a change. We know that we're not sure exactly how to make it, but we understand that we need to work on the skills and less on the content, but make sure that they lead us to some kind of a vocational target, but not leaving the humanities aside. So to me, if it was like an ideal world, I would like to have maybe more problem-based learning, make sure that we solve problems from the real world and not just some kind of a theoretical problems. Make sure that it's interdisciplinary and not only from one aspect. I mean, what is the role of the researcher? Should we have different people working on research and others mentoring the students? I mean, maybe we should have different models and test them out to see which one will survive our future. How do you see this?
Yeah, universities used to teach young people to do their work, and now we live in a time in which learning has become the work. I think what you can help young people is, become, active learners, being able to, take the courage to see and navigate into different futures, build that agency, that capacity to mobilize your cognitive, social, emotional resources, because it's not just about knowledge, it's skills. I actually think attitudes and values are going to play a much more fundamental role. Now, can you have that kind of compass that tells you, what's right and wrong, what's good and bad in a specific situation, that helps you take responsibility and see yourself in the right place in society? And I think that's something where universities can provide an amazing framework for, to help young people, become active contributors, people who see that develop their sense of responsibility, their agency to make a difference in this world. And project-based learning, I think, is not just a good method, but it's also a good way to give you as a student a role to set your own learning goals, to monitor your own learning progress, to take responsibility for the outcome, for the management of resources. And I think all of those things are very, very important. It's not a replacement, for knowledge. You cannot do a project when you do not understand the substance on which you work. But I do think it's an incredibly important next step to, not just make you reproduce what you know, but make you take responsibility for, making sense of the world and helping others to make sense of the world.
We're coming to our end of this interview, and I do want to give some time to a couple questions that are related to your visits to Israel and to higher education. I've looked and I've read from one of your last visits that you had some kind of reservations about the K-12 schooling, which is not enough. It's too structured and that doesn't enough give incentive to the children to think creatively. Too much is based on memorization and not enough on the creativity. And nonetheless, when we look at our startup nation, we still have a considerable amount of youngsters that are pretty creative and are actually doing pretty well considering the number of unicorns, at least from Tel Aviv University. So how do you explain this? It almost seems like a contradiction. We don't do well enough in education, and then we have these wonderful, young, brilliant people.
Yeah, absolutely. It has been a puzzle for me all along. On the one hand, as you say, when you speak with people in Israel, this is the nation of creativity. This is the nation of ingenuity, where a lot of, ideas are being shaped, tested, questions, reborn, and so on. And at the same time, you go into a classroom in a school in Israel, and it's very traditional, content reproduction often. How do you bring that together? And in fact, I've asked myself that question many times. I think there are two dimensions for this. When you ask yourself, what's the share of the population Israel's economy is really built on? I mean the top end of the economy. 10%, 15%. I don't think we would agree on more than 20%. It's actually a pretty small slice of people who run that innovative economy in Israel, and it's actually far easier for an education system to sort people, to find those people who are, those great innovators, than to build broader foundations from this. And that's where I think the school system could make such an important contribution in the future, not just to filter out those who are going to become, the next startups and the next successful entrepreneurs, but to put more people on the playing field. Because, even if economically you can be successful in the aggregate in the long run, where we see educational polarization, skills polarization, we're going to see, social polarization, we are going to see labor market polarization, political polarization. So I do think there's enormous scope, in my view, in the school system, just to make sure that, the future is built by everyone and not just by what is actually a remarkably small share of Israel's population currently. So that's how I reconcile those two dimensions. There's another aspect to this. You have a quite traditional school system, very, very traditional, vertical. It's still very much about, teaching facts and figures. And at the same time, the military probably makes a really important contribution, giving people real responsibility, putting them in the field, allows them to, develop that skills-based component that is perhaps missing in the school system. So there are other factors as well. But my worry is really that at the moment, the system is far, far too narrow and leaving too many people out of what could be an equally successful life. No?
So one way of thinking of it is to actually try to bring all those things that you've mentioned, the space, the autonomy, the independency, to bring them to the school systems, both the lower education and the higher education. That would be the way. One way that we've started a few years ago is starting to bring academic education to the schools, not the best of the best to the university, but bringing academia to the peripheral and geographical periphery. Do you think this is a way to go as well, to kind of, I guess, lower or bring bridges between K to 12 and the academia and kind of smooth it so people won't say it's only a matter of age, it's really a matter, if you have it, go ahead and try your skills?
Absolutely. I'm a firm believer in those kinds of approaches. Ask yourself why so many young people disengage with STEM, in school. STEM for many is an abstract school subject of formulas and equations. It has very little to do with the ideas of STEM. And the reason is, the first thing we do in school is we take the T out of it, the technology, that is really what makes STEM engaging. And we take the E out of it, which is about, making young people, entrepreneurs, engineers, people who can do things. And actually the academia can bring exactly those things into school. It's a very different story if you hear about STEM from, a teacher or someone who has a real passion for it, whose life has been framed by STEM, who has, can convey, what how does STEM, how does science open life opportunities, career opportunities for men and women? I do believe if we were better in integrate, if universities would not just see schools as a supply chain for their enrollment, but actually see how they can shape the next generation of people and give them inspiration, ideas, and passion. I think we could see the best of two worlds. I do think teachers greatly benefit when they actually work with people who devote their life to a
Yeah.
topic that they may just teach on the margins. No?
I can't finish without talking about AI because we really haven't talked about AI, but we need to ask that. Because again, I think we have this division of people, those who firmly believe that we need to, AI is here and we have to work with it and do whatever we can. And there's still a group of people saying we still don't know what the negative influence of AI is on our thinking, on our youngsters' thinking. It's very nice to say that AI should augment and not replace, but we all know ourselves. We always kind of tend to go to where it's easier, and if it's easier to go to AI who will think for us, then it's going to eventually replace us and not augment us. What are you thinking? What is your thinking on this? What is your take on this? And how do we make sure that we're always making it's an augmentation and not a replacement, at least for our thinking and brain?
It's so new that it's really, really hard to answer that. But, I don't see AI as a magic power. It's just an incredible accelerator, an amazing amplifier. It's going to amplify good education and good practice in the same way it amplifies poor practice. It can, if you're a university professor, it can, help you personalize learning, make learning more interesting, engaging, and so on. Or it can make you to follow scripted lesson plans. I think that's really what this power is. I'm personally very optimistic about the use of AI for the how in education. And again, why would you listen to a teacher in a large lecture hall to explain the results of a scientific experiment when you can do that experiment in a virtual laboratory, in an AI-enabled learning environment, and so on? So I think when it comes, or think about learning analytics, as an educator, you can now see how different students learn differently. Enormous potential in the how. Where I am more reserved is on the what. I think there is a great risk that we make humans more like computers than the other way around. I think the danger of AI is not that, AI is going to become like humans, because by its very nature, works very differently than humans. I think the real risk is that we make humans more like, what AI generates by rewarding those kinds of mechanisms. And, I did our PISA survey some years ago, and I was absolutely shocked. Even in a country like Israel, you had almost half of 15-year-olds who could not navigate ambiguity, not carefully distinguish fact from opinion, even in quite simple contexts. And I ask myself, how can this be? These people have been for a decade in school, and they do not master what, every journalist engages with every day. And then, the answer is very much that, in school, we make people believe in things and learn things and reproduce answers rather than to learn to ask questions. And again, I'm a scientist by background. It often breaks my heart when I see how we teach science like religion. We make people believe in some scientific theory, then we give them lots of exercises to practices, and at the end we test have they have learned the answers we taught them. Has nothing to do with science, and that is what makes us the slaves of algorithms. I do believe when it comes to the what, I would rather think we should focus on what are our most human skills and strengthen our capacity to make judgment, to make ethical judgment, our capacity to extrapolate, our capacity to see that bigger picture. And I think so. On the how, yeah, absolutely. I think AI is going to revolutionize the delivery of learning and make a lot of things very different. But on the what, I think we should rather concentrate on what makes us different as humans. But that's just my personal view in a context where we really do not know how tomorrow is going to look like.
Well, I think it's a great ending because I think that gives us something to actually not feel like, wow, we don't have anything to do about AI and we'll just have to accept it and go with it, but actually, as academic people, each one in his own world can think about exactly what you're telling us now. How can we, what is the difference? What can we do better than the AI, and what AI cannot replace us, and work on those skills and thoughts? But that will definitely change what we're teaching.
Mm.
We will have to do that because clearly right now we're teaching a lot of things that the AI can do.
Yeah.
So
And I think that's and I think, you know, if you teach something AI can teach, you will no longer be in business for a long time.
yeah. And we want to stay in business
Yeah.
because we still believe in higher education. Only
Yes.
we have to reinvent ourselves, I guess.
I think so. You know, I do think that is the and I think it's not just invent higher education. I think higher education is there to help us in society to reinvent our future and to be
Mm-hmm.
a, you know, a leader in that kind of futures oriented thinking.
I accept the correction. You're absolutely right. Listen, it's been really a pleasure. It's been, I think, eye-opening. I think it's been very inspiring. And I feel like after this interview, I want to go and make that change. So thank you very much for the time you've given us. And
Thank you
I really hope the next time you'll be able to physically come and we can have this interview in person. So thank you very
very much.
much.
Look forward to that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.